John Kennedy would be exposed to. It's the fact that he's going to double back on Southern Democrats. He also early on knew that he more than likely would be forced to put Lyndon Johnson as his running mate, which meant mending that fence and doubling back on his stance on civil rights. John is going to have a hard time in the swing states, the South and the Midwest, because of his Catholic faith and background, his father's reputation, and the possibility that those in Washington who were FBI staunch believers might act somewhat seditious against him, considering what Bobby had done. As a result of those factors, Joe Kennedy realizes they need help, and a lot of it. So he's going to attempt to use his friends for help with the understanding that, like Costello said, one hand washes the other. So before we get to that, we have to discuss something that takes place in 1947 because of its implications. In 1947, specifically in November, John Kennedy delivers a speech to Congress supporting a $220 million aid package to Italy. Kennedy would say that Italy was in grave danger from the communist minority and that Italy would be the initial battleground in the communist drive to capture Western Europe. He also stated that he wanted to combat Soviet efforts to take control of the Middle Eastern and Asian countries like Indochina. Now, you might say, okay, Jeff, this is 1947. What in the hell? Why are you bringing that up? What is the relevance? Well, Indochina is a very interesting place to bring up. Keep in mind the time period that we're dealing with. Luciano had been instrumental in helping the war effort, especially in Italy. Luciano's prison sentence for pandering would be commuted by Dewey in 46, and Luciano would be expelled back to Naples. In October of 46, Luciano makes his way to Cuba. It's also in 46 that the Havana Conference takes place. And one of the major discussions that would take place was narcotics. Luciano prior had the route set up, and it's worth noting that the opium used was coming from Afghanistan and would flow right through the Golden Triangle, which included Indochina. It's odd to me that in 1947, Kennedy would want to protect Indochina from the Soviets, when in all reality, I think this was more about narcotics than anything. And sure, you could call it a stretch, but of all places you worry about, Indochina would be the last that I would be worried with. In many ways, the drug trade wouldn't really fly open, full stretch until the 50s, but Luciano and company had already established those routes and ways of moving narcotics from those areas. And this is one of those things I like to call circumstantial supposition. In any event, as we said, Joe Kennedy called in a favor. He wanted to meet with Sam Giancana. Giancana was born in Chicago in 1908, and he pretty much was born to be a gangster. By the time he was a teen, he had joined the 42 Gang, and the 42 Gang was a gang that was running during the Prohibition of Chicago. They were named after the Alibaba and the 40 Thieves, and members often came from the Patch and Little Hell, which is northwest of the Loop in Chicago. Most of their early crimes were theft, breaking and entering, and everything in between. The 42 Gang was pretty violent and prolific and eventually would catch the eye of the Chicago Mafia during Al Capone's tenure as boss. The mob would hire, from time to time, they would grab members of the 42 Gang to do a little bit of work for them. But more often than not, it was very minuscule things because the 42 Gang was insanely violent and they brought a lot of heat. All the cops knew who they were. And the one standout from the 42 Gang would have been Sam Giancana. Giancana's early rise in the underworld proved a few things. Number one, he wasn't afraid of anything or anyone, and he was willing to do whatever it took. He was known as a great dependable getaway driver, skilled in murder, and he would be the first of the 42 members inducted into the mob. Eventually, as we know, the 42 Gang would pretty much be absorbed into the Chicago mob. Some notable members of the 42 are Sam Giancana, Sam Battaglia, Luigi Fratto, Phil Aldericio, Sam DiStefano, Charlie Nicoletti, Fioro Bussieri, Billy Aloisio, Frank Caruso, Willie Dodano, Joe DeVarco, Marcello Caffiano, Mario DiStefano, Bruno Tassione, and Joey Melita. Giancana was violent, an incredible earner, and controlled a ton of turf, controlling gambling, and he even moved rackets into Louisiana, controlling some of the big political rackets. But in 1939, he ends up taking a pinch for bootlegging and is sentenced to 4 years in Leavenworth. I believe he actually split time between Leavenworth and then state prison as well. In 1942, Giancana walks out of the prison gates. At the time, Frank Nitti was the boss, at least in name and face, but many think Paul Ricca had pretty much already taken over, considering that Frank Nitti had a lot of real mental illness shit going on. Keep in mind, Frank Nitty's the only guy that managed to kill himself by shooting himself in the back of the head 3 times. So, at the time, Louis Campagna was the underboss, but was getting ready to head off to prison. So Tony Accardo was getting ready to assume that role. Giancana goes to see Tony Accardo, and he suggests to him that they begin to absorb all of the African-American numbers rackets. Accardo agrees, and Giancana goes to work. He would chase out local bosses, forcing Eddie Jones to hand over the reins and flee the country. August 4th of 52, Giancana and his crew whacked Teddy Rowe, who owned a ton of African-American gambling halls. Rowe and Jones opened the South Side, but Giancana put a stop to that without hesitation. So they're just absorbing anybody that they can. Next up would be Big Jim Martin, who was the last holdout of the policy games on the South Side. Giancana went to Jackie Cerrone, told him to handle it. Cerrone shot Martin twice in the head, and somehow Martin survives, but he ends up fleeing the country. And that move makes Giancana a prized commodity. Not only can he kill, but he can earn. And he could also give orders and lead. And this is what led Rica and Accardo to anoint Giancana the front boss in name in 1957. Accardo and Rico were still the bosses, but they allowed Giancana to be the street boss, and everything that really needed to be decided needed to go through Accardo and Rica. In many ways, I've always felt that Rica and Accardo knew that that was probably the likeliest, smartest move for them. Put somebody out front who's really not the brightest bulb. However, at the same time, Giancana had also proven himself to be somebody who could earn, lead, and be violent. So it was a good decision for them at the time. And I don't think they realized that a lot of that would go to Giancana's head. I think if they had realized that early on, they might not have made that decision. So Giancana becomes the acting street boss. But once again, all big decisions, anything big, specifically had to be cleared by Tony Accardo and Paul Rica. So, as we stated before, Sinatra, being close with Giancana, offered Joe Kennedy an opportunity to get things done. Now, this is where things are going to get a bit interesting. And I say interesting because it's been reported differently by a lot of different people. Authors have claimed that the meeting took place in Chicago at a hotel. And I can tell you that anybody who reports that it took place in Chicago isn't accurate. There's just no way. It's the easiest of explanations because, and what I mean by that is it's easy for authors to say, oh, it would have been in Chicago because that's where Sam was. But that's really not where it happened. And that's the easiest explanation authors can give you. But the reality is Kennedy is not going to be seen in Chicago, and he's not going to be seen meeting with Giancana. He's not that stupid. And vice versa. It's not something Kennedy would have done. And I can understand, based on the fact that Kennedy did meet with Costello openly, is likely why authors would naturally assume that. The problem is, many of these books that make those claims obviously didn't research Frank Sinatra or those around him. And the fact is, the FBI was already all over Sinatra and watching him closer than you might ever expect. Everything from just how women screamed at his concerts, to him whoring it up. He once got arrested for having sex with a married woman. I forgot what the exact term was. Hilarious that they used. It was seduction. He was arrested for seduction. I didn't know that was a fucking crime. But the FBI had been looking at Sinatra, for about every creepy reason that you can ever possibly imagine. Now, the question is, did John Kennedy know that his father was going to meet with Sam Giancana? And here's the thing. I cannot tell you for 100% certainty that he knew initially, but I think in a relatively short period of time, he probably found out, because later on down the line, he would end up partying with Sinatra, Willie Moretti, and Giancana in Las Vegas and in other places. And those are facts that we'll get into a little bit later down the line. But where was this meeting? Where did it take place? Well, the Cal Naval Lodge. The Cal Naval Lodge was built in 1926 by Robert Sherman, who was a real estate developer. He sat on the board. The club sat on the border of Nevada and California, which would become a resort and casino, and sat gently on the shore of Lake Tahoe. It went through a handful of different owners who revamped and added features to the lodge. Sinatra had actually visited the lodge in 1951, and that trip really wasn't a good one for Frank, as he attempted suicide by overdosing on sleeping pills, and all of that mess had to do with Ava Gardner and just kind of the shit that was going on between them. Sinatra would come to love the place because it offered him peace away from Hollywood. It offered fun in the sun where him and his Hollywood friends could hang out and just not have to put up with reporters who had really been hounding Sinatra nonstop for 2 decades already. Sinatra eventually would inquire about the resort and would end up purchasing the resort in 1960, along with silent partners Dean Martin, Hank Santacola, Skinny D'Amato, and Sam Giancana. And he would actually buy the lodge through his Park Lake Enterprises. And if you ever research Park Lake Enterprises, Sinatra owned a ton of property. But it's very interesting how he used Park Lake Enterprises. I'm not going to get into all of that because that's kind of not the story, but there was a lot of filtering with money going through that enterprise. So the property would end up being open year-round. Prior to that, it was only open during the summer, and Sinatra would add a celebrity theater, and he would add a helicopter pad so he could fly in and out, whenever he wanted. Underneath of the lodge was Prohibition-era bootlegging tunnels. And that was a selling point to Sinatra because mob guys could funnel in and out of the resort and could move from bungalow to bungalow without being seen by anybody publicly. One specific tunnel led from the main building to a private residence, which was overlooking Lake Tahoe. Oddly, the day that Sinatra was signing papers to take over ownership, guess who was seen there by the FBI? Yep, Sam Giancana and Joe Kennedy. In fact, this is about to get really funny in terms of organized crime. It really is. So Sinatra, who we all know was incredibly wealthy in 1950, 1960, he was just loaded already. He used, listen to this is great. He used Teamsters pension funds given to him by Jimmy Hoffa as a loan to expand the lodge. The FBI had acted on a tip that Sinatra was attempting to purchase a casino on behalf of organized crime members, and that's what the FBI believed, and that's why they were surveilling the property. While I can understand certainly, that assumption, in this case, they would be totally wrong because that's not what Sinatra was doing. But in many ways, he was helping facilitate East Coast gangsters getting into ownership in Las Vegas. That is what Sinatra was sort of guilty of. Sinatra carried ownership in several casinos, the Dunes, the Sands, and he held secret ownerships for Carlo Gambino, Raymond Patriarca, and Santo Trafficante. In name, Sinatra would own these shares, but in reality, the owners were Patriarca, Gambino, and Trafficante. So Sinatra, more than anything, wanted the Cal Neva to just be a hotspot destination, right? And I literally sitting here and I show pictures on, go over to my YouTube community page. I posted photos. I actually have matches, dice, and an ashtray from 1960, the year that they opened. But Sinatra wanted this to be a Hollywood playground, and it would become a destination for the mob, famous actors, dignitaries, and of course, John F. Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, and Joe Kennedy, who all three of them loved banging Hollywood starlets. And that was the place they were going to be able to do it. So Sinatra is going to sign the deal to take ownership. And to my knowledge, based on Hank Santacola, Julia Rizzo, and Tony O, and George Jacobs, who were all there that day and who have all written books and talked specifically. And the stories are identical. So there's not much change in the log line. So I tend to believe it. But Sinatra signed the paperwork with his lawyer and then excused himself. He would travel through the tunnels and it would open up to a big private home overlooking Lake Tahoe. He would enter, and not long after, Joe Kennedy would show up, as well as Sam Giancana. While a ton of the specifics are minimal, what I was able to sort of kind of figure out using FBI reports and books written by Jacobs and Tony O and Hank Santacola, who were actually there that day. And here's sort of the gist of what happened. So Joe Kennedy explained that John Kennedy was going to need help in Chicago and West Virginia and other states. The Catholic thing was a huge problem for Kennedy. Kennedy would explain that if they could help swing votes in mob-controlled districts in Chicago, specifically the 1st, 24th, 25th, 28th, and 29th wards, that could help John. But they needed help with the 45 other wards, and that Chicago Heights and Cicero, they would need help as well. Giancana allegedly explained that the mob owned the 1st, 24th, 25th, 28th, and 29th wards, and that nobody could interfere in those wards whatsoever. Giancana would explain that Chicago Heights and Cicero would go Kennedy, and he would see to it that more people vote than ever before in Chicago Heights and Cicero. And that turned out to be the case. Kennedy was concerned with, like I said, the other 45 wards because even though John was a Democrat, he worried that the Catholic vote would impede the election. Giancana more or less assured Kennedy that all Union guys, specifically the Teamsters, would all vote Kennedy, and they would be told to do that, and that Mayor Daley would be a huge part of these other wards, and he would work with them. Giancana explained that Daley would do as he was told, and that Murray the Camel Humphreys, would make sure that all the Teamsters did the right thing, and if they didn't, legs and jaws would be broken as a result. So Kennedy was happy with the news, but according to Jacobs, Kennedy worried about West Virginia, specifically because it was a Bible-thumping state, a Protestant state, and Giancana said that they would use friends to help the voting there, and if worst position sort of arrived, they would put mob-connected associates in to run the voting booths, and that anybody who came in to vote, Kennedy would be voted twice, and whoever the challenger would be, once. Giancana would also explain to Kennedy that Hollywood is going to go Catholic and that Frank would do all he could to shore up Washington with free benefits, free concerts, money raising, and more. And he would do that in the same states where Kennedy might have some problems, specifically West Virginia. In return for services rendered, the mob expected a bunch of things. Number one, Bobby had to stop his public witch hunts. They just had to stop. He had to leave Jimmy Hoffa alone, as Jimmy Hoffa was the mob's guy. They also wanted the FBI controlled, and they wanted all eyes off of them, and they wanted to move in silence. Any indictments would be stopped at the doorstep of the FBI. Giancana also wanted Cuba back. According to those in attendance, Kennedy guaranteed that the FBI would leave the Mafia alone, and they would be free to do as they saw fit, and any investigation into their actions would be stopped by John Kennedy before it went anywhere. On the Cuban front, Joe would explain that John hated Castro and that one of his first steps would be to overthrow Castro. If it could be accomplished, the Mafia could do as they saw fit there. That was basically the deal. Kennedy would get the Teamster votes, leg breakers would be put into place to help, and anything Joe needed, he would get. Anything John needed, he would get. The mere fact that Mayor Daley was on board was great news for the Kennedys. They all left that meeting with that understanding. Giancana would head back to Chicago to begin to put things into place and make calls to other bosses explaining what the plan was. And Sinatra would benefit by beginning to set the stage for campaign benefits and more. The problem was Kennedy made a lot of promises he couldn't keep or just wouldn't keep. Joe Kennedy had made a very, very bad calculation that day. And that calculation being he underestimated the mob's resolve. So John Kennedy begins to stump. One of the more unique things that he did, because he knew early on the Catholic shit was going to hurt him, but he would consistently hammer home the idea of separation between church and state. And basically what that did was that kept people engaged, and it also bent the minds of many staunch Catholic haters. If Kennedy could separate his job from his religious viewpoints, then the voters could too, and that's just the way he saw it. While Kennedy would face Democratic challengers like Lyndon Johnson, Adlai Stevenson, and Hubert Humphrey, Kennedy just kept going. Bobby, of course, was added to the campaign, but John would add Kenneth O'Donnell and Larry O'Brien to the campaign team, making it a flush Irish campaign management style. While Kennedy had a long road to go, one of the things that he did do was involve himself in primaries. And if he could win those, it meant he could very well get the nomination, which is what he wanted. So his first major primary was in Wisconsin, which he won, pretty much putting Hubert Humphrey out to pasture. But Hubert Humphrey was at least going to have another opportunity. So while Humphrey didn't really have a chance of winning, the two would face off in West Virginia, the one place that Kennedy would have serious issues. Kennedy needed that West Virginia primary badly. If he loses that West Virginia primary, he likely would not get that nomination. And this is when organized crime gets into the fray. And this is just primary shit they got involved in. They would also get involved in the actual election itself. So, number one, a Catholic likely couldn't win in the Bible-beating backwoods of West Virginia. Protestants and Baptists, okay? Those are just facts. Kennedy needed a lot of help. Well, in that primary, Kennedy faced Humphrey again, and both did really well as far as arguing points, but it looked as if Kennedy might not be in the position to win that primary. It could have gone either way. You know, you're going to have those that are going to say Kennedy wiped the floor with him, but it was really close. And just Kennedy didn't want to leave a lot to chance. But in Wisconsin, Kennedy got the Catholic vote, and overwhelmingly so. Plus, he got the Teamster vote. But in West Virginia, it was different. Kennedy sort of kind of needed a miracle, because if he doesn't win this primary, the likelihood that he could get the nomination at the Democratic convention it's dicey. It's not a sure thing. Now, what I'm about to tell you, you can believe me, or you can just say I'm making it up. However, I knew somebody who has passed away who was a grandfather of a friend of mine who was from Huntington, West Virginia. He was not a mafia guy whatsoever, but he did some things, okay, as far as he was needed by some people. Let's just put it that way. So a few days before that primary, this is the exact story he told me and his grandson while I was sitting there. And keep in mind, he was like in his 80s at this point. He had a big elbow to us. Anyway, side note. So he told me and his son that he got a call from people asking him to go work the primary booths. Now, new machines were being delivered, and about 25 guys got calls to head down to the local polling stations to learn how to use the machines. According to my friend's grandfather, they were told by what were essentially goons that when people came in, they will vote, but that right after they vote and walk out, they're to enter the booth, close the curtain, and pull the lever for Kennedy. And this is exactly what he said to me. So you can take that and do what you want with it. So for every vote, Kennedy would get a vote. If people voted for Kennedy, Kennedy would get 2. Now, I know what you're going to say. Wait a second. If that was the case, then the numbers would be all fucked up, and you would be right. But they also had a division within West Virginia that counted the votes and ensured that the numbers would match. So they had this all planned out. This is, anyway, a lot of dead people voted in that primary. And Kennedy would win that primary tenfold. And that's not, is it shocking? No, it's not shocking that he won, but it's shocking at the sheer numbers of it. So let's look at some numbers. Kennedy would face off against Humphrey and Pat Brown, right? They would face off 13 times between March 8th and June 7th of 1960. Kennedy, in those 13, would go 10-3, and in those 13 primaries, with Johnson being his main competition, didn't even take part in the primaries. Neither did Adlai Stevenson. Kennedy would win the following states: New Hampshire, Massachusetts, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Chicago, Illinois, Indiana, Oregon, and Nebraska, of all fucking places. The vote totals: Kennedy, 1,847,259. Brown, 1,354,031. Humphrey, 590,410. Kennedy got 31.4% of the vote. But if you look at that West Virginia primary, it pushed Kennedy over the threshold. And that's why this is so important. Let's look just a bit deeper. In New Hampshire, Kennedy got 85% of the vote. In Wisconsin, 56%. In Illinois, 65%. Pennsylvania, 71%. Massachusetts, 92%. Indiana, 81%, which is odd, but the mob controlled a lot of areas. So it's Illinois, 65% is a very strange number. Wisconsin, 56%. It should have been a lot higher. Anyway, Nebraska, 89%. West Virginia, 71%, and so forth and so on. But if you look close, especially at that primary in West Virginia, Kennedy spent almost $2 million fucking dollars in 1960. Hubert Humphrey only spent $23,000. Now back to my friend's grandfather. They were all paid $10,000. This is what he said, to make sure that votes went the right direction in that primary. 25 people were paid $10,000 apiece. It's a lot of fucking money in those days. Now, inflation, that's $20 million in 1960. 2 million equals $20 million. Who spends $20 million in a single fucking state? And what can really be accomplished with $20 million, you ask? A lot of things. And that's just something to kind of put on the back burner. So while Kennedy is winning in West Virginia, it shocked about everybody, including West Virginia's Protestants. And a lot of people in West Virginia began to talk about there being a fix. And I'm not going to get into the whole Protestant versus Catholic thing, but there's a massive hatred there. And the fact that a Catholic won in a fully loaded Protestant state smelled fishy to a lot of different people. However, what does Joe Kennedy do? Joe Kennedy ensures that if West Virginia newspaper outlets have any desire to call it a fix, he bribes them and pays them off. I have paperwork that shows that Joe Kennedy donated north of $5 million to all of the newspapers in West Virginia as a charitable gift. Because once again, Joe Kennedy, he buys people off. He doesn't want any bad press. He doesn't want anybody looking into what's going on. So even though Kennedy ends up winning and the bribe is in and all of that, West Virginia is still uncertain. But remember those numbers we talked about earlier. Just wait until we unveil the numbers for the presidential race in Illinois. That's going to shock you. And you're not going to believe it. Just remember, Cicero and Chicago Heights. So at the 1960 Democratic Convention, it was going to be held in L.A., from July 11th to the 15th, the candidates for the Democratic nomination, albeit major ones anyway, were Kennedy, Pat Brown, Stuart Symington, Lyndon Johnson, Adlai Stevenson, Wayne Morse, Hubert Humphrey, Lyndon Johnson, and Symington and Stevenson and Johnson all declined to take part in primaries. Harry Truman came out in support of Symington, saying that Kennedy was too young and inexperienced to be a real president. But that frustration went back sometime with Kennedy for not backing Truman and his bills, and Joe Kennedy hating Truman. While Kennedy was certainly one of the top contenders for the nomination, he lacked enough delegate totals to get the nomination. So a week prior to the convention, Johnson, who at the time was the Senate Majority Leader, announces that he's going to run. Adlai Stevenson, she also announces that she's going to run. Is Adlai Stevenson even a woman? I'm assuming so. I could be wrong. Anyway, so Johnson wasn't fucking around, and Johnson challenged Kennedy to a debate before a joint meeting of the Texas and Massachusetts delegations. Kennedy would accept, and by many accounts, Kennedy won, and many people believe that Johnson couldn't win past support in the South. So that's a big thing. So we got to go back to the why. I said the South was so important. Kennedy had gerrymandered support from the South, and he knew eventually he was going to change his stance. But he needed the South. And perhaps the best way to ensure that, as I said, was by bringing Johnson into the fold and using him for his power in the South. Now, I don't want to get into all the plot points of government, but on July 13th of 1960, the third day of the convention, Kennedy would gain a narrow majority on the first ballot. It was widely believed that Kennedy was in deep trouble, but Bobby used his little pissant technique and his little badgering, along with an old blackmail technique that his father used, to acquire critical delegates at the last minute. It wasn't just because men had a change of heart. They were bullied into it, blackmailed into it, and they had no choice. Bobby was threatening to expose everyone. The final tally really wasn't even close. Kennedy got 52.9% of the vote. Johnson would get 26% of the vote, and it wasn't even close. Kennedy would secure the presidential nomination. And this is where things get very interesting. It was shortly after that, at the prodding of his father, Joe, that he asked Johnson to be his vice president. The move shocked everybody, including Johnson himself, who was no fan of John Kennedy or the Kennedy family, especially Bobby. So some over the years have said that it was just a courtesy move. It's just the right thing to do. Because Kennedy, originally it's been said that Kennedy wanted Stuart Symington to be his vice president, but Joe Kennedy got his way. And that's just the simple goddamn truth to the matter. Joe Kennedy told John, what he should basically do. Johnson would accept and agree, but was shocked by the request. Not hours after Johnson accepted, he gets a knock at his hotel door. He opens it, and who's there? The little fucking pissant, Bobby Kennedy. Bobby walks in and tries to dissuade him from taking the position as John's running mate. John's already made his decision. He's already accepted. What the fuck is Bobby doing? So Bobby tries to dissuade him, and Lyndon Johnson loses his shit And he point blank just asks Bobby, what the fuck business is it of his? And who the fuck do you think you are? And it's been said that Johnson said, listen, you're John's little brother. You don't know shit. Johnson was furious and ends up throwing Bobby Kennedy out of his hotel suite. Then he calls John Kennedy on the phone and asked him what kind of fucking game he was playing. And John was completely confused by what Lyndon Johnson was pissed at. Johnson would explain what happened, and John explained that Bobby had no business doing that, and the nomination was definitely his if he wanted it. Don't worry about it. And Johnson once again accepted. And that was just the first of many nasty fights and words between Bobby and Lyndon Johnson. Now, according to documents released in 1993, according to John F. Kennedy's secretary, Bobby didn't want Johnson around because he felt that John was being blackmailed by Johnson. Now, first of all, well, let me just read this. There was a meeting between John and Bobby where Bobby screamed at John that John was only offering Johnson a ticket because Johnson had proof that John F. Kennedy was banging women and that the information was being provided by J. Edgar Hoover. The problem is, this was just Bobby fuming over the McClellan hearings and that Johnson never once intimated or even insinuated that John was going to be out in public for womanizing. This was Bobby paranoid and trying to control things like Joe Kennedy did. John knew he needed Johnson to win the South, bottom line. It had nothing to do with any kind of blackmail. Bobby didn't like his decision because he didn't like Johnson because Johnson was friendly with J. Edgar Hoover. And so Bobby comes up with all of these conspiracy theories. It was Bobby trying to control his brother and what was going on. And so John made his choice in his running mate. And things are going to get messy. Things are going to get incredibly messy as Bobby continues to create havoc. He continues to try to control the optics, and he continues to make more enemies than friends. John is going to need help to win the presidency because Richard Nixon is no chump, and that race, for what it's worth, is going to be a nail-biter. So when we come back after our vacation, it's everything leading up to the race, the final numbers. Sinatra goes to bat. Kennedy's going to win the election, albeit fraudulently in many, many ways. But there's a bigger issue. Almost a cataclysmic event is coming that nobody ever foresaw. The pissant is going to be let off his leash. Those consequences, along with Bobby continuing to fuck with Lyndon Johnson, is going to create a tidal wave for the Kennedys, and not in a good way. You will see more so at the end of this series that Bobby Kennedy was the fucking problem. A huge fucking problem. But that problem gets rectified in ways that I can't apologize for. Joe Kennedy, who made all the promises in the world, is about to welsh on the one promise he should have never welshed on. And it's also going to destroy him and his entire family for generations. So there you have it. So we're going to take a week off. And when we come back, we're going to continue with the Kennedys. In the meantime, if I don't get to your guys' emails in the next week, it's because I'm on vacation. And I'd like to enjoy my vacation and stay away from the mob talk. But please email me about the Capone thing. That's important because maybe we can do a live with that. All right, so enjoy Mob Talk Radio. At this point, we're going to get into the next edition of the Kennedy crime family. So when we left off 2 weeks ago, John F. Kennedy was preparing to run for the White House. Not only had he stormed his way throughout the Democratic circles, but his father, Joe, had essentially pulled the cards for him. John Kennedy knew all along he would need the Midwest to rally for him, and he knew Southern states would have to come out in big numbers for him. One of the chief concerns inside the Kennedy camp was the votes from the South, because Kennedy was Catholic, and many of the Southern voters were very anti-Catholic. But Kennedy would give a rousing speech about the separation from church and state, hoping that that would alleviate some of the Southern concerns about his religion. While Kennedy had a lot on his plate, there was a lot going against him. For starters, Bobby Kennedy had created a lot of enemies in Washington. Bobby had published a book in 1960 entitled The Enemy Within, which essentially blasted the unions and organized crime. And if that turned the heads of the mafia, it basically turned the heads of the mafia like The Exorcist. But not many would say anything. And I think a lot of the concerns that the mafia had was somewhat placated by the promises from Joe Kennedy that if John were to be elected, with, of course, the help from the Mafia, especially in those wards where Kennedy was behind, then Bobby would go quiet and John would do all in his power to shut down investigations and more. The problem with that, however, was J. Edgar Hoover, who really all along left the Mafia alone until the infamous Appalachian incident. And that ended up having sort of forced his hand into making some general concessions. The fact is, Bobby wanted everybody prosecuted, especially from those McClellan hearings. And when J. Edgar Hoover ignored his stammering about prosecution, it just created a nasty, nasty relationship between the two, which both Joe Kennedy and John wanted Bobby to fix. There was a lot to worry about, too, considering Kennedy was knocking every broad that came within 3 feet of him. And then there was the not-so-well-kept secret that Kennedy had Addison's disease. So while Bobby was a pissant in every single form and fashion, he also, in his own way, was trying to protect his brother. But rather than do things the silent way, he was brash, insulting, and pretty much an uppity prick about everything. So while Kennedy didn't like Lyndon Johnson at all, he brought him into the fold because he knew that when he became president, Johnson, or prior to that, he knew that he needed Southern votes. So bringing Johnson on helped the voting process. But at the end of the day, it wouldn't matter because Johnson would just be another face in the crowd with little say and input on anything that John F. Kennedy wanted to do. Plus, bringing Johnson into the fold would almost secure, like I said earlier, those needed votes in the South. So when we talked last week or the week before, we know that Bobby was irate that Kennedy chose Johnson as his running mate and fumed and seethed at that idea, almost accusing his brother of not having any intelligence because Bobby feared that Johnson would use Kennedy and that Johnson had already leaked out the information to the press about Kennedy having Addison's disease. The reality is Johnson probably did out him. He probably did give up that information, but this is a situation where, you bring Johnson in because by proxy, you can somewhat control him. You bring him in, the optics look good to the Southerners, but then you just keep him outside the circle of trust. And looking back, it was the worst decision that he ever made. And perhaps on many levels, Bobby Kennedy was right all along about not trusting Lyndon Johnson. Because remember, Bobby had gone to see Johnson at his hotel room, and the two got into their first of some 36 knockdown screaming matches. By allowing Bobby to go and deliver messages to Johnson, John Kennedy is somewhat insulating himself. In any event, Johnson was in whether or not Bobby liked it or not. Maybe there were some early warnings, too, that Johnson was not well liked for a lot of different reasons. So after he is named running mate, George Meany of the AFL-CIO president basically called out Johnson as the arch nemesis for organized labor. So already from Jump Street, people were not exactly thrilled at the decisions that John F. Kennedy was making. We talked the other week about how vote rigging had been set up in West Virginia and other places, and this would be the same tactic used for the presidential voting system. However, I want to step back to Frank Sinatra for a second. And the reason why Frank was so integral to the Mafia and to the Kennedys, as we said, was because he made the introductions. And one of the big concerns, other than his Catholic faith and his father's past and his brother's behavior, was those unions. Remember, Kennedy blasted the unions nonstop when he was a senator. Bobby Kennedy went after the unions. Bobby's antics infuriated the unions. And that is exactly why Sam Giancana and others getting involved was so important. With the mob pushing the unions, they wouldn't vote for Kennedy. So if the Mafia isn't pushing the unions, forget about it, especially when you consider Jimmy Hoffa. And so you might ask, well, what about Jimmy Hoffa? Because surely he would not have voted for Kennedy or allowed the unions to go that route, or at least to vote that route. He would have done everything to stop it. And you'd be right in asking that question and also thinking that as well. In 1957, as you know, obviously, Hoffa was basically voted out as president. And the reason was because he was facing a major criminal investigation as a result of Bobby's little witch hunting drama called the McClellan hearings. On March 14th of 57, Jimmy Hoffa attempted to bribe an aide to the select committee and got caught basically red-handed. He would, however, deny all those charges and somehow would be acquitted of those charges. However, that action just propelled indictment after indictment, arrest after arrest, and led to dozens of investigations. Hoffa had warned the Mafia not to trust those fucking Kennedys under any circumstances, but it fell on deaf ears because the end of the line for the mob was we can control the president, and that's what we want to do. Why they believed that, I'm not exactly sure. So because Hoffa was out as president and wouldn't be elected until 1961, reelected, it meant that Hoffa had zero sway within the unions, and because of those investigations, Hoffa really becomes a pariah amongst everybody. He was just too hot, he was a big target, and nobody wanted him meddling into their business. Those unions, though, the Kennedys needed that vote. And it was just as important as the votes in the South. And believe me, had Hoffa still been the president of the union, I do not think there is any way they would have voted Democrat. I just don't think they would have. And I think there was just too many hard feelings. And they didn't want oversight into the unions. So Sinatra would go to work, putting together huge benefits for JFK. Hollywood donor dinners, radio ads, and the Rat Pack was front and center for all of it. Dean Martin, who hated John Kennedy, begrudgingly helped, as did Sammy Davis Jr. However, he would be in for a shock as the Kennedys desperately wanted Frank to step in and stop the marriage between Sammy Davis Jr. and the white model My Brit. Joe Kennedy especially was infuriated that there was an interracial marriage. They didn't like it, and they did everything they could to try to force Frank to stop them from getting married. So much for the Kennedys being all about civil rights. They would even put pressure on Sinatra to either force Sammy to move his wedding date or else, because the wedding date was very close to the voting. The nuptials infuriated the Kennedys so much that they disinvited Sammy Davis Jr. to the inauguration performance, a move that hurt him deeply and also infuriated Sinatra to no end. Dean Martin, on his part, refused to help or do anything at that point after that. He was slated to be at the inauguration ball, which he refused to do. But Sinatra really had no choice because he was the one that would set the whole entire function up. But because of the pressure, Sammy would actually end up changing the date of his nuptials till after the election because the Kennedys were afraid that Sammy marrying a white woman would destroy his chances of winning, which is repugnant. And like I said, it shows you just how non-racist the Kennedys were. So even so, Sammy Davis and Dean and the rest of Hollywood would pony up for Kennedy at some of these donor dinners. So Sinatra goes all in. He lends his private jet to Kennedy so he could fly in style. While Sinatra was jet-setting back and forth from Sin City, oftentimes him and John Kennedy would meet out west for some booze, broads, and debauchery. It was through Sinatra that JFK meets Marilyn Monroe, Judith Exner Campbell, and a million other broads that he would bang. Bobby, on his part, would also bang Marilyn Monroe and other starlets as well. But he didn't seem to have any sort of issue with Sinatra then, that he didn't have any issue with his boozing, or his carousing, or his friends at that time. But this would change very quickly. Sinatra would even revamp his home in the desert so that when JFK came to town, it would be like the Western Whitehouse. Sinatra had a helipad installed, changed the entire dynamic of the home, and even had the home outfitted with separate phone lines and additional amenities for the Secret Service. But he would be totally embarrassed when JFK would go and stay at Bing Crosby's house, who Sinatra seethed was a fucking bum Republican. If Sinatra ever needed a sign that the Kennedys were loyal to one name, and one name only, it was then. So as the presidential campaign kicked off, and Sinatra was busy working his magic in Hollywood, Bobby begins trying to downplay their Catholic faith during the primary. But he would use that in the general election, taking almost an aggressive stance. So prior to the presidential campaign, he wasn't very aggressive about it. You know, it is what it is. We're Catholic. But once he's running for president, he really begins to get aggressive about it. John's campaign, once again, would be run by Bobby and others, but was completely funded by Joe Kennedy. And we know Kennedy would win the nomination and would bring in Lyndon Johnson as his running mate, as we said earlier. At the beginning of the fall election campaign, it was obvious that Kennedy would be taking on Richard Nixon, who was ahead in the polls at that point by 6 points. And the major issues were getting the economy stimulated again, the Cuban Revolution, and whether or not the Soviets had surpassed the Americans in space and missile programs. His faith really became a hot button topic, and Kennedy, sensing that this was going to be the case, would say, "I am not a Catholic candidate for president. I am the Democratic Party candidate for president who also just happens to be a Catholic. I do not speak for my church, nor does my church speak for me." Protestant speakers went after Kennedy's religion almost nonstop. It was almost unrelenting, and this is one of the core reasons why Kennedy needed the mob so bad. The first few debates against Nixon would be coming, and in that first debate, Nixon almost, in some ways, just looked off kilter. He didn't look into the camera. He veered off into the distance. Kennedy, on his end, looked relaxed, almost subdued, and that may have had to do with the amount of painkillers that he had been given prior to that debate. Kennedy had a big pill problem, a big painkiller problem. Kennedy daily received shots for Addison's disease and was often on some sort of painkillers for his back injury. The visual difference was stark because those who watched the televised debate felt that John F. Kennedy would won, whereas those who just listened to the debate on the radio felt that Nixon had won. So everything was optics. For Kennedy, the Southern voters who watched were abjectly against Kennedy and began to see a different side to Kennedy. And the optics of Johnson certainly didn't hurt his chances either. For the most part, this was the first election in United States history in which television played a significant role in politics. The one thing or facet that helped Kennedy with the African-American vote is that 1 month after making the speech about separation between church and state, Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested and jailed in Atlanta. King had been arrested for violating his probation when he protested at a whites-only snack bar. Kennedy, sensing he might make a move, took a big risk politically. He ends up getting involved. And the reason why I say it was a big risk was that he risked infuriating the Southern voters who were all for segregation. And not to stereotype all the Southern white voters, but one of their main stances was segregation. They wanted things segregated. And with Kennedy stepping inside that threshold, he risked upsetting Southern votes. So most would see through that move as a political optics sort of move. And Bobby was allegedly against it completely, saying that while they could agree with the civil rights, while they could agree with the rights of all, it wasn't worth upsetting Southern voters. John didn't listen and made a call to Georgia Governor Ernest Van Diver and then Judge Oscar Mitchell, in which Kennedy explained that there would be riots in the state and that it was better for all to release Dr. King to save the city from burning down. And they would all agree and Dr. King would be released. So after that first debate, Kennedy would gain a few points in the polls, and according to most of those polls, Kennedy would forge ahead of Nixon. But it wasn't by leaps and bounds. It was by 0.2 of a vote. When the country would head to the polls that November, nobody would understand just how close it would be. In the national popular vote, Kennedy would win 49.7% to Nixon's 49.5%. In the Electoral College, Kennedy won 303 votes to Nixon's 219. 14 electors from Alabama and Mississippi refused to support Kennedy because of his stance on civil rights, and the whole Martin Luther King thing hurt him there. Mississippi and Alabama would actually vote for Virginia's Harry Byrd. It's a funny name, Harry Byrd. So, as it would turn out historically, the help that Kennedy got from the mob worked. Had he not invested so much money in states, had he not paid off all of the people in West Virginia, this very well might have been a very, very different ending for America. If you remember when we talked about those voting districts in Cicero, Illinois, and you can go look up those numbers for yourself prior and post, but people came out in record numbers in those Illinois districts for Kennedy, just as Daley and Giancana had promised. Those districts were widely Republican, all went Democrat for some reason. Kennedy would win the election and everybody would fucking celebrate. And I often wonder, what the mob guys were thinking. I mean, by most accounts, it was all right. We got our man in, but I don't think that they had any fucking idea what Kennedy was about to do to them. So Kennedy becomes the youngest president elected to office of President of the United States. He would be sworn in January 20th of 61. Kennedy's first act is to restructure how the White House worked. He wanted the White House organized as everything was a branch off of him. It branches off of him. He would hire both experienced and inexperienced people to work with him in the White House. What Kennedy does next stuns everyone. He names his brother, Bobby, Attorney General of the United States. Reality was Bobby had zero experience, but he got the job not because John wanted it or wanted to give it to him. In fact, John didn't want to give it to him at all. However, Uncle Clobbercrotch, Joe Kennedy, demanded that Bobby be named Attorney General, which should be no shock to anybody. The Senate Judiciary Committee didn't want to approve Bobby, feeling that he was not experienced, but for some odd reason, his mortal enemy, Lyndon Johnson, was prodded to help, and he stepped in and he backs Bobby Kennedy. And if you thought that Bobby was done telling his brother what to do, you'd be totally wrong. And it was Bobby who not long afterwards told his brother that he could not name William Fulbright Secretary of State. When JFK asked Bobby why, Bobby explains that Fulbright, while he knew foreign politics, was a white supremacist and believed in segregation, and it would cost him black votes. Unbelievable. Politicians in Washington also worried that Bobby Kennedy had way too much power. It was one thing that they were related, but everybody knew that Bobby was running around telling JFK what to do and how to do it, which was not his job. Now, I'm not going to cover, obviously, Kennedy's accolades because it's not integral to what we're talking about. So I'm going to sort of bob past the Berlin crisis of 61. So feel free if you want to go look that up for yourself. But Kennedy walked into office with some major things going on, especially with the Soviets, Berlin, and then Cuba. And then civil rights was about to get very, very, very nasty. And Kennedy does almost an immediate about face, which made many in Washington, especially white Southerners, irate, especially those who had backed him because they thought that he would be for segregation. So as I said, Kennedy at the end of the day didn't really give a fuck about civil rights, but he knew which political plot points to hit, and he would make that his crusade after the fact. And it was basically telling those who supported him to fuck off after he got their votes. That's essentially what it was. Many Southern Democrats and Republicans were not happy with Kennedy, and with Bobby posturing as the poster boy for the new sheriff in town, eyebrows began to raise. So at the end of the first year, early signs of the Cold War were coming, and Kennedy was pretty much enraging everybody in the Senate, who worried that he wasn't skilled enough to take on Russia. However, for the Mafia, something else began to happen. Bobby almost immediately begins to go after the Mafia and the unions again. In fact, in that first year, convictions against mobsters went up 800%. Bobby had changed how the Attorney General's office operates. Originally, usually the FBI and the Attorney General had worked hand in hand, but Bobby would change that. He said that J. Edgar Hoover worked for him, and that he would have a special buzzer installed on his desk, which would go off in Hoover's office, telling him that he was needed. Bobby didn't want to hear anything Hoover had to say, but was rather bossy and told him how things were going to go. In one meeting, Hoover explained to Bobby that organized crime wasn't the top of the list of problems that the country had, and they should be focusing on the Soviets and communism, which he felt was more pressing. Kennedy would tell Hoover that organized crime was the biggest problem in America, starting with the Mafia and Jimmy Hoffa. Hoover attempted to explain to him that Hoffa was not a communist, but Kennedy laughed and threw him out of his office. So any attempt J. Edgar Hoover tried to make with Bobby, saying this isn't really where the focus should be, Bobby didn't give a fuck. Bobby would be unrelentless with the Mafia and everybody who had helped John Kennedy win the election. And everybody that was involved in that was going to be slated for public humiliation and indictments. Sam Giancana was especially fucking mad. Giancana took out his anger on Frank Sinatra and blamed him for the entire thing. Giancana knew that Sinatra was tight with Peter Lawford, who was married to Pat Kennedy, and he presses Sinatra to get a message to the president to knock it off or else. Sinatra, on his end, knew it wasn't his fault, but he was embarrassed because he had been the mob's middleman in this entire fiasco. So Sinatra places a call to Peter Lawford, who he basically asked Peter Lawford to come out and see him in Palm Springs the following week. Now, keep in mind, Sinatra was still having his Palm Springs Kennedy house finished. Almost as soon as Kennedy won the presidency, he's thrown aside. It turns out it was Bobby who put a stop to that immediately. One of the issues and one of the narratives, which has been stated wrongly, is that Hoover went to Bobby and explained that Sinatra was hooked up with hoodlums and that they had wiretaps with Judith Exner Campbell and Giancana both talking to Kennedy on the phone. I have never believed that Hoover had those tapes, because if he did, believe me, he would have used that against Bobby and put Bobby in his fucking place immediately. That's exactly what he would have done. The truth is that JFK stupidly put a taping device in his office, and Bobby and a few others had access to that. It was Bobby who picked up on those tapes and in a curse-filled tirade told John, if the public finds out that you're fucking other women, your presidency is over. If they find out how we use the mafia in voting districts, it's over. You have to cut ties to Frank Sinatra immediately. Jackie Kennedy also fumed over Sinatra because she knew that Sinatra was the link between JFK fucking starlets. And a side note to all of that is Sinatra had affairs with both Pat and Jackie Kennedy. So anyway, so a wiretap ends up getting put on Sinatra's phone, and Bobby finds out that Sinatra was on the phone with someone talking about a scheme to have sex with Patricia Kennedy in order to get an inside track to get Bobby to lay off the mafia. At least that's what Bobby told John. But in all the research that I did, the majority of those files you can actually get access to, and there was never a mention of Sinatra talking about that. So I believe it's likely a load of shit designed by Bobby to just sort of get John away from him. And all, like I said, all this was Bobby doing as he was told by Joe. Joe Kennedy was leading the ship. They had all used the mafia, they had used Sinatra, and they had gotten what they wanted. Therefore, they needed to insulate themselves. They needed Peter Lawford, who they never really liked, to rid them of Sinatra, and immediately. So Peter Lawford, who by all accounts is a great actor and a lush and a womanizer, was sent to deliver the news to Sinatra. He would arrive at Sinatra's Palm Springs compound. Sinatra was running around making sure that all the construction was coming along as quick as possible, and John was due to be out in L.A. in a month's time. Lawford sat down and explained that John was going to be staying at Bing Crosby's. Crosby was a Republican. Sinatra blows a fucking gasket and begins running around telling all the construction workers to leave and starts using a sledgehammer on all of the walls. He actually had installed a plaque on the wall stating that John F. Kennedy slept here and with the date. He rips it off the wall and begins screaming, ranting, and raving. If Lawford was worried, the next few sentences out of his mouth would end their relationship for the rest of their lives. Lawford was basically used by the Kennedys to send bad news. So Lawford goes on to explain that Bobby had gotten in John's ear and that they could no longer be associated with him because of his mob friends. Sinatra blows another gasket, screaming at Lawford that his friends got that prick elected, and if Bobby didn't stop his witch hunting, there would be consequences for all of them. Lawford apologized but basically blamed it on Bobby being an overbearing prick, and that he was sure that John would actually meet him secretly out west when Bobby wasn't around. But for Sinatra, it was like a slap in the face, and he threw Peter Lawford off his property and never ever spoke to him again. And in fact, Peter Lawford's acting career was over that day because Sinatra made sure he couldn't get a fucking job. And Sinatra was the type of guy, you crossed him, you were done. You were a ghost to him. And if Sinatra ever had any reservations about Lawford being his friend or in his inner circle again, the death of Marilyn Monroe would totally destroy that. And we may touch on that on this show. I'm not sure if I want to cover that. So while Sinatra was hurt, he had a much bigger problem. He was drawing the ire of Sam Giancana. Giancana needed somebody to blame, and Sinatra was the target of his rage. Sinatra was supposed to do a benefit out in Chicago with Dean and Sammy for Dismas House, but had decided not to go. He canceled it. And that only infuriated Giancana even more. And on an intercepted wiretap, Giancana is talking about wanting to kill Dean Martin and Sinatra. He wants them dead. The problem is Giancana didn't have that power. And when Accardo and Rica find out, they put Giancana in his place immediately and explained that Sinatra was absolutely untouchable because he was one of them, which just meant he's a friend of ours. You're not going to do that. This is not his fault. So there was a lot of drama to go around for the mob. They're reeling over Appalachian, the McClellan hearings, and now Bobby is going to go after everybody. Bobby had only been limited because of Hoover refusing to prosecute guys. But now that Bobby was the attorney general, he could do whatever the fuck he wanted. Nobody was going to stop. A lot of outsiders felt that Bobby was just settling old scores, and it was a personal issue. However, the mob didn't see it that way. They saw it as a personal persecution in order for the Kennedys to hide their secrets. In 1961, after Bobby is named attorney general, Bob Morgenthau was named the top federal prosecutor in Manhattan in the Southern District of New York. Morgenthau, along with Bobby, launched a plan to dismantle all of organized crime in America. It was the beginning of a massive shitstorm. And so, we're going to, I think, stop right there, believe it or not, for this week. Sorry, I'm adjusting my notes here. 1 second, guys. Sorry about that. Blah, 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 blah. Sorry about that. I totally lost my place. Okay. So, basically, we're going to stop right there. And here's why. Because next week, Bobby is going to launch his war on the Mafia. The mob is getting pissed, beyond pissed. Not only are they being assailed, but Bobby, not to be intimidated, has New Orleans mob boss Carlos Marcello kidnapped, thrown on a plane, and Marcello is going to be tossed out of the plane with a parachute over Guatemala. The hope was that Marcello would never come back. Despite Bobby's hope, a very angry and infuriated Carlos Marcello walks through the jungles for days and finds his way back to American shores with one thing on his mind: killing both of the Kennedys. And he wouldn't be the only one. Other bosses begin to talk about the problems that Bobby is causing. They want both of them dead, and for a lot of good reasons. John is sadly going to take the blame for everything, and that's because he lacked the balls to put his brother in his place. Sadly, a mobster would be caught. A mobster would be caught on wiretap a few months after Kennedy's assassination, saying, "We whacked the wrong Kennedy." And oddly, we are about to see some strange events take place as the Cold War begins, the Cuban Missile Crisis begins, and for some odd fucking reason, the CIA turns to the Mafia for help with ridding themselves of Fidel Castro. Why on earth the Mafia even allowed the Kennedys to approach them after what Bobby has started doing blows my fucking mind. But I think there was a lot at play there, and I also think that Bobby was unaware. But I don't know. We're going to have to debate that. So next week, a lot is going to happen, and it's all going to come to a crescendo of the 35th president of the United States getting whacked in broad daylight. It's also going to lead to Bobby Kennedy getting whacked too. And if you buy the Sirhan thing, you'd be nuts because Kennedy was actually shot from behind Bobby, not from the front. There are going to be a lot of players, a lot of scheming, and we aren't going to get into all of those conspiracy theories. But when it comes to the Mafia or any involvement, we're going to cover that in detail and try to give you the backgrounds. But ultimately, and not to spoil this for you now, but the Mafia didn't kill John F. Kennedy. The CIA did. And there's a lot of reasons for that, justifiable, and some reasons aren't. But as I said, I only wanted to cover this from the mob's perspective. And we'll probably end up doing a live show discussing the theories just for fun. But I just wanted to give you the things that nobody usually discusses. So with all of that being said, come back next week for another episode of the Kennedy Crime Family. We maybe one more show left, maybe two. I do hope that you have enjoyed this series, at least learned something from it, and reach out to me and let me know what you think. mobtalkradioshow@gmail.com. In the meantime, have a beautiful weekend. Look out, it's hot everywhere. It's hot everywhere. But thanks for tuning in. We'll see everybody next week.